complicated, you know, man. Like a dang Rubik's Cube, man. You like talking about that blue, red, man, then you get to one side and like messed up.
All right, George Bagby, welcome back to the Jay Burden Show. How are you doing?
Oh, it's great to be here again.
I know I'm genuinely happy to have you back. Obviously, you and I continue to talk even when we're not live on a podcast, but it's very rare that I get a solid hour-long uninterrupted conversation. So I really look forward to these.
Me too.
And I'm also actually this would be maybe a good thing to start off with. And I know that there are certain things that you cannot discuss, right? I understand. But could you kind of provide a very brief, just summary of kind of what's happened after the big fundraising event? Because I think for a lot of people, that's the last they've heard of you.
Indeed. Yeah, I think that was the last time that I made an appearance on any stream. Since then, I've taken my funds from the fundraiser. I sold my commuter car and I upgraded to a nice big van. So now I can work with Lyft and Uber, and I can just go from one to the other. Both of them have perks and incentives and things like that. But what that means is that I don't have downtime unless I want downtime. So I've been able to maximize my efficiency, and also because I have a big van, I can fit lots of passengers, and that means I qualify for better fares frequently. And that means that I'm basically in business for myself now. I already had a good thing going there with doing the rideshare, but now I'm doing ride sharing full time in New Orleans and I'm making bank. Like I'm making more money than I've ever made in my life.
Well,
So
good.
I'm doing really well and I've got a lot to be thankful for.
Well, I'm genuinely glad. In a strange way, even if there was no, obviously, the monetary payout was the reason we did that stream, and everyone was incredibly generous. I got to meet, just a few days ago, I got to meet Drew, right, one of the big benefactors. I don't know if you remember him, but he he said he'd match whatever anyone else donated for the next hour.
Oh wow.
And then Charlemagne came in with a $300 donation. So, of course, Drew was on the hook for, I think, more than he was expecting. But genuinely, and I've gone back and listened to that, that massive 8-hour stream. And I genuinely, I don't know, that's probably one of my favorite things that we've done. In addition to, obviously what we accomplished, it was just a genuinely like good, positive stream. Like especially you talking to, I think it was Red Hammer is the name he goes by. I can't remember exactly. But, you two just talking about faith for an hour, even if nothing else, I think was a incredibly worthwhile conversation.
Yeah, that was all a very rewarding thing, um, obviously for me. But I'm very thankful for everyone that chipped in, everyone that showed up, everyone that gave me kind words during that time. That was extremely encouraging to me and to my family, and I'm very grateful.
Well, good. I'm glad to hear it. So, in addition to covering that, there's one other item of business, which is that I am sponsored by Axios Training Group. Right? Many of you have heard the spot that I've done for them. But we've actually launched a new program. So one of the big things that obviously Bagby and I support, as well as JD, the guy who owns Axios, is bringing this into real life. Right? Turning this from an online space into something real. And so this new program we've launched is essentially a way to do that. And there's a small fee. It's not very much at all, less if you use my link. And basically what this lets you into is kind of an online mediated fitness group, right? So you can do the exact same workout that I do. You can see how much work I'm doing, if I'm slacking. And if you want to see if you can, out bench Burden, so to speak, be the strongest beaver of them all, then that's the best way to do it. Anyway, you should check that out because, JD, he's a good guy. He's a member of Exit Group along with both, George and I. And he's an all-around, like upstanding guy. He's one of us. And if nothing else, you guys could probably use the exercise. But anyway, that's not the point of this episode, George. You and I wanted to talk about social decay. And I think both of us have had firsthand experience, over the last year or so. You mentioned that you're working as a, essentially a cab driver in New Orleans, right? And so I imagine you've gotten kind of a firsthand exposure of urban decay. Is that correct?
Indeed. Yeah, this has been something very much on my mind lately because I see it every day now.
Yeah, and I will say it's one of the things that I've enjoyed, and other people have mentioned that your Telegram messages have been have been really popular, right? You have a Telegram group where you kind of record little messages about what's going on during the day, and obviously, they're interesting, right? But at the same time, they're also kind of depressing. That even though it's interesting, just as kind of like an anthropological piece, it doesn't seem to be a healthy city. Is that correct?
Yeah. Well, it doesn't help New Orleans that the city has marketed the the Bourbon Street area as a place for people to come from around the world to lose their minds. They have a tiger by the tail down there, and they don't know what to do with it. It brings in a tremendous amount of money into the city, lots of travel and hospitality and all sorts of things. But there's crime down there. Um, there's all sorts of degeneracy going on down there, and it's very dysfunctional down there. You know, there's all sorts of like third world sorts of problems in New Orleans. The breakdown of regular infrastructure that people count on. Like there are all kinds of major intersections where the traffic lights do not work. And this is such a persistent problem that the city has put up little stand-up stop signs at the intersection because they don't know when they're going to get to that. There are areas around the city where the water mains are broken and the water just gushes into the street and washes away the pavement. Um, there are all sorts of crazy problems going on in New Orleans, outside of the craziness down in the French Quarter. Um, but some of these problems um, certainly are things that people elsewhere in the United States would be familiar with. The tent cities of homeless drug addicts. We've got that in New Orleans, at least in one area. I know what that's like. I spend a lot of time at those intersections. I see those people. I see how they live. I see the debris of their lives. Every once in a while, I think they just voluntarily abandon their camps. No one in the city is chasing them away. The city actually puts up porta potties for them, trying to trying to curb the another major problem in New Orleans, which is public urination and defecation. They try to curb that in the homeless encampments by putting up the porta potties. But there are all sorts of bizarre problems down there, and I think these are problems that are increasing in major cities around America, and we have every reason to think that they will increase in the short term for sure.
And I think the thing that's so galling about this is that we don't have to live like this. You look at a country like ours, which is incredibly wealthy and seems to have an endless supply of resources for blowing other people up. And I don't mean to say this out of some kind of like socialist or like communist instinct, far from it. But there's something to be said for the fact that this is something that is, in the grand scheme of things, a relatively recent development. American cities didn't used to be like this. And obviously, places like New Orleans, even the town that I'm in, have always had a seedy underbelly, right? America has always been kind of like a violent and raucous place, compared to other places in the world, right? And that's not what I mean. But the level of just like pure entropy that you see in the heart of all these cities, right? I was in I made no secret of the fact that I lived in Richmond, Virginia for some time. And that is a city that has been taken over by entropy. I remember there's just something, and I remember talking to, a mentor of mine about this, where it's like, I just want to live in a place where I don't see someone dying every day. Where I don't see someone, essentially one overdose from just dying on the side of the street. And I think that those instincts of like horror and disgust are good, right? You should feel that way.
Yes.
And this kind of like put upon attitude that, some urbanites have of like, oh, you just have to get used to it. Like, oh, that's just how it is. Well, is it? Does it have to be?
It's not normal.
Right, exactly. And there's so much effort put into convincing you that this is how it's always been and it's the only way it could ever be. And look, like New Orleans is a great example. Detroit is a great example. All of these cities that are now blighted, they're essentially almost unlivable. Used to be these kind of like idyllic, not perfect, these kind of like idyllic places where you could, safely walk the street at night. Instead of now, it's almost
Yes.
like, it's like a zombie movie. You'll be eaten.
Indeed. Now, I'm older than you, and so I know that I can have a curmudgeonly sort of tone when it comes to these things, but America wasn't always this way. And what's the bigger point here, because I'm talking about New Orleans? New Orleans wasn't always this way. New Orleans used to have a functional city government. And I've become very interested in the history of the city just by driving around in it every day. It is a storied place. It is a very beautiful place, in spite of all of the horrors that it harbors these days. I've driven in New Orleans and I've driven in Baton Rouge, and I'll choose New Orleans every day of the week because it's so interesting, because it's so beautiful. The streets have such amazing names. There are the streets named after the seven muses, for instance. Clio and Melpomene and Terpsichore and Calliope. Though down in New Orleans they call it Calliope instead of Calliope. That's actually where the main homeless encampments are. Is Calliope Street. But the city is just filled with names like this. Hector Street, Telemachus Street, Dante Street. These are names that are extremely important to me, and I'm always driving down those streets with a big smile on my face, even when it's in a bad part of town. But the architecture is just so lovely. That city was built by very sophisticated people. It is now increasingly taken over by very violent people who are discarding their urban inheritance. They're discarding their own lives. There are people shooting up drugs on the street corners. I've seen this myself. The city police department is totally overwhelmed. It's really funny what they choose to police and what they ignore. There are cameras around the city that will photograph your license plate if you're 5 miles an hour over the speed limit, and you'll get a ticket in the mail. I was dealing with that earlier today. I was sending off a check for a speeding ticket, my very first speeding ticket in my whole life. I paid today because there is a camera in New Orleans. But the police will not go look at the homeless encampment and all the various law breaking that goes on there. Most alarmingly, I was driving down a major thoroughfare in New Orleans this last week, and I had a fare in the back seat, a couple from out of town, and I saw a man on the side of the road. This is a major city street, and apparently he had just been shot. And this was in the morning. This was at 10 p.m. or something. He had been shot, and he was bleeding out on the sidewalk, apparently. I saw him right as the police were arriving at the scene. And I've never seen that kind of thing in my whole life. I know New Orleans has got to be one of the most violent cities in the whole country right now. But to be a witness of a drive-by shooting, like the immediate aftermath of a drive-by shooting, that's not a normal experience. That is extraordinary. To see people shooting up heroin in broad daylight, that is an extraordinary experience. That is not normal. To see hundreds of people sleeping in makeshift huts in an urban district in America, that is not normal. That is extraordinary. That is strange. We don't have to live this way. You're entirely right. And seeing these things going on, in just my work life, I must admit has brought out the authoritarian in me, you might say. There must be order.
The thing that I feel like is a perfect encapsulation of this is the Justin Neely case, right? This death that happened, on the subway. This man was killed as, bystanders started to, attempted to restrain him. And I realize that it's a sensitive subject, so I won't get into it. But to me, the fact that this happened at all is a profound failure, for a variety of reasons, right? That, the NYPD, one of the largest police organizations in the world, essentially just allowed this man loose on the subway. He had a series of felonies. He was out. He had a warrant out for his arrest when he died. And my point is not that he should have died. My point is that it never should have gotten to this. It never should have gone this far. And there's something kind of ghastly about the fact that, and I've brought this up before when discussing the death penalty, where essentially, right, it's fine as long as we don't directly cause the harm. As long as we're not the ones, doing something nasty or unpleasant, it's fine. Now, these people can kill themselves, slowly by injecting poison into their bodies. They can terrorize other people, but we wouldn't want to throw them in some type of mental institution. That would be ghastly. And so because of that weakness, essentially, this man is now dead. And he shouldn't be dead. He probably should have never been out on the street by himself. And I was reading a Substack article somewhere. Basically was tracking the delta between the number of people involuntarily committed to mental institutions and the number of people incarcerated in prison, right? And there's a very, very strong negative correlation there. Right.
Yes.
That essentially, as we got taken over by this like one flew over the cuckoo's nest ideology, where really, people with, these mental diseases are, they're perfect angels. And if we could only understand it, and I don't mean to make them sound like they have moral agency, right? I think like many of these people are genuinely unfortunate, but nonetheless, the idea that, the solution to that is essentially to allow them to free range over our entire society it's just kind of like personally galling. And the last thing is again, it's just like, I think that we can't fall into the trap of assuming that they're too stupid to notice, because the people in charge obviously don't care. Genuinely. If anything, it's a boon to them, right? Look at this Jordan Neely case, right? They genuinely don't care that this man has died, because to be honest, if they cared about his well-being, they would have done something about him a long time ago. New York has massive social services, but he was still essentially, living out on the open streets. But once he's dead, he's useful. He's an engine for political power. And to me, it just reminds me very much of that classic Sam Francis essay about anarcho-tyranny, right? That, it's not a problem that the subway's being terrorized. It's a problem that someone stopped him. And again, I don't think it's good that this happened. I think if anything, it's a failure, but it very clearly outline what matters and what doesn't matter to the people in power.
I see this phenomenon of anarcho-tyranny frequently in New Orleans. Not so much of, well, I I wasn't really there for the tyranny. I know about it and I talk about it from time to time. During COVID, the city government of New Orleans was pretty notorious for going all in on COVID protocols and really extreme strictures on vaccines and such. They attempted to police the local businesses to restrict access to people who had not received the vaccine.
Well, I actually did. I tell you the story of how I how I had to sneak in to a restaurant in New Orleans because I couldn't find anywhere to eat.
No, no, I didn't hear about this.
So this was actually the time that a friend and I came to visit you. I think it was over. It was not this last January, but the one before that. It was when I was still in school, and it was at kind of the last gasp of the COVID regime. And my friend and I had come into town, stayed at a very rough hostel, right off of St. Charles, under the bridge. We didn't realize that we were so close to, again, one of the homeless encampments. But either way, we got into the city pretty late, and we didn't realize, again, because it's New Orleans, you never think that this would be the case. But they had this draconian COVID lockdown, and my friend and I couldn't eat anywhere. Uh, so
It's amazing to look back on that and realize that we really did live through that time.
Oh, I know, and it's even more amazing to learn that the gumbo shop just off Pirates Alley uh, was fully contented with a very obviously blank PDF of a vaccine card.
Yeah, that
uh,
that was the bright side to that attempt by the city government at tyranny to try to shut down access to the restaurants of New Orleans. If you can imagine, this city probably has more restaurants per capita than most American cities. You can imagine why. That's one of the reasons why people go there. But they tried to get the restaurants of New Orleans to scan vaccine certificates for every patron. And the result was widespread rule breaking, like prohibition. Prohibition didn't work in New Orleans either. There's a very famous story of a journalist that traveled around the United States during Prohibition to find illegal drinks, to try to find the speakeasies, and he wrote articles about it. And the story is when he got off the train in New Orleans, he jumped into the taxi cab, and the cabbie pulled out a cocktail mixer from under the seat to offer him a drink. And he declared New Orleans the wettest city in America. And it's a delightful story that I like to tell because now I'm a New Orleans cabbie. But the thought that you could enforce such rules in New Orleans is also preposterous. But the downside is there is widespread lawlessness in New Orleans. I just mentioned the guy shot on the street as the extreme example of that, but I was a witness to that. When I go into certain neighborhoods in New Orleans, and these are notoriously the worst neighborhoods. These are neighborhoods where there is quite a bad reputation. Um, I go into these areas with fares in the back seat. I was trying to figure out the demographics of this certain neighborhood. It's a very large area, and I couldn't find the demographics. So I can't say. What I can say is practically everyone that I've carried in this neighborhood is black. And I realized, just this last week, every single time I went into that neighborhood with a fare, the fare warned me not to stay in the neighborhood. These are the people that I carry in my car. They got in the car. I usually ask them, to confirm the address that they're headed to before I start out, because sometimes it's wrong. And they say, "Oh, well, do you like going to that neighborhood?" And I say, "When I accept a ride, I usually don't know where I'm going," which is true. I usually don't check the address. If you don't accept the ride quickly, then they could offer it to somebody else. So I usually just press the button and accept the ride. And these folks that I was carrying to this neighborhood would say, "You need to not accept any rides in that neighborhood. You need to just turn around and go out of the neighborhood." Late the other night, I accepted a very long fare. I went all the way across the city with an elderly grandmother, and she was celebrating she had set up, an event space for her granddaughter who was graduating high school, is what it looked like to me. So she had stayed very late to set up this event space and decorate it with streamers and things like that, tablecloths and flowers. I saw lots of things in that area. And she got in the car, and I confirmed the address with her, her destination, this rough neighborhood. And she said, "I'm really glad that you accepted my ride. No one wants to drive in that neighborhood." Well, I hear that all the time. And I said, "Well, it's all in a day's work, you know?" I said, "I'll get you home, no sweat." And I got her home, and her husband came out of the house to meet her when I got to the house. And they came up to my window and they wanted to talk to me. And I rolled down my window. The lady got out of the car and they turned around and they talked to me through my driver's side window. And they said, "You need to log out and drive straight out of this neighborhood. Do not stay here." They said, "It's too dangerous." And I noticed that they were wearing T-shirts, and their T-shirts said, "Stop the violence." There were these bright red T-shirts, and it's a local campaign. I see signs in people's yards that say, "Stop the violence." And New Orleans this year, I think, is gonna break their all-time record for murder. There are lots of people dying. Sometimes there are 2 or 3 murders a day in the city. But I wonder what does anyone expect the police to do? Not just in New Orleans, but just generally speaking around the United States. Does anyone really expect police to enforce the law aggressively? Police are not going to be tolerated doing anything aggressively. I can't imagine what the proposed solutions are to this sort of problem where you have out of control violence and just general lawlessness. Just as another example, something that I see very frequently in that rough neighborhood, in that particular neighborhood, I see terrible car accidents in that neighborhood. And it's no wonder because people take the red lights as suggestions. When I pull up to a red light in that neighborhood, now this is not the case all over the city, but in that neighborhood, when I pull up to a red light, I see people run the red light every single time. I started testing it the other day. I was like, okay, I've stopped at the red light. Am I going to see someone run this light? And I see people run lights all the time. There is just a general sense that the rules do not apply in that neighborhood. And it's a frightening thing, right? It's the Wild West. And it doesn't surprise me that there's so much gunfire and such because it's like every man really is out for himself in that particular area.
I think there's something to be said that the people on our side of things tend to blame the people doing these things as if they are the origin of these problems, right? And if we take the lessons of elite theory seriously, right, which I think we should, we're all downstream of that. You understand that these people are acting according to incentives, right? They are
Yes.
clients of the regime, and so they will not be punished. And Thomas is good about bringing this up, that these communities didn't used to be like this. They've always had issues. There's always been deep issues in America, but they weren't like this. They weren't this wild, this lawless, this violent. And I think it's important to remember that these people aren't winning. In the short term, maybe you could say, well, you're winning because you get to speed without a speeding ticket. Okay, maybe that's a small victory, but these are not good lives. These are not lives we should in any way, envy, right? These people are immiserated, and I'm sure you get
Yes.
a frontline view of that. I've mentioned before the fact that my wife worked at an inner city school, and you have to have a sense of human compassion for these people, especially children, right? Because many of them are young kids, 6, 7 years old, and it's almost hopeless already. And I don't know. I think that there's a very human desire to say, yes, punish them, sweep the streets of the people causing this. That's probably rational. But at a certain point, you're charging the cape and not the bullfighter, right?
Yeah.
These people didn't just wake up one day and decide, well, I'm going to let society burn. There's a lot of
Yeah.
things upstream of that, and I think it's interesting as we kind of examine things like the Great Society, things like the systematic destruction of currency, and social fabric, and these kind of like ethnic communities. We should not be surprised that things have gone badly. Maybe we didn't think they'd go this badly, but it's almost deliberate.
Indeed. It bears repeating. We must always remember that before the Great Society, back in the back in the 1960s, the Black American illegitimacy rate was lower than the white illegitimacy rate is now. There are more white people born out of wedlock today. Now that's a historic high for white Americans, but there are more white people born out of wedlock today than there were Black Americans born out of wedlock then. So there has been a tremendous sea change in the Black family structure since the Great Society, since the Johnson administration, just as an example, since the Civil Rights Movement, which it coincides with. Um, the the Black neighborhoods in American cities did not always operate this way. And there was a time when there was not all of this crime going on with impunity. And that's also important to remember. I'm aware that there are the detractors who will say, "Oh, well, you just aren't used to big city life. You've got to get used to these things. There's always a lawless element. There's always an underclass. Yes, there are, but it does not dominate entire regions. We're living in a time now when this is becoming normalized, and it's frightening to the people there. The people that live there, that deal with it every day, are terrified of it, and they tell me that they are, and they tell me I should be, and they say things are bad, things have never been this bad. These are the people that actually live there, and they don't want to live that way, but their leaders have led them into that position.
And
It's a very sad thing. When I'm driving around in the rough area late at night and I see the people just barrel through the red lights, Now it's late at night, so the risk is much lower. It's actually a lot safer to drive late at night. I'm frequently out until 3 or 4 in the morning. Just the way that I drive, it works for me, and it's an efficient time to be on the road because there's no traffic. But I see like a souped up Lexus speed through a red light in the middle of the night, and it's got, lights on the undercarriage. It has all sorts of fancy features that have been added to the car. And I see him go by, and what comes to my mind is he is a local lord. He's the count of this neighborhood. He's a crime lord in all likelihood. He's the pimp of the prostitutes down the street. That's another wild thing. It's not far from the Baptist seminary, actually. There is an open air sex market where the prostitutes come out and walk around after dark. And they are there. Every time I go through that neighborhood, they're there. I've talked to law enforcement about it because I guess I'm curious. I'm wondering if the state police might do anything about it. So I called the state police to find out. But they're there every night. Nothing's happened. It makes me wonder. I tell jokes about enforcing prohibition in New Orleans. Am I really naive enough to think that someone is going to enforce vice prohibitions in a place like New Orleans? Um, maybe I shouldn't even inquire about it, but the guys running the red lights in the souped up cars, they have they have some kind of regional authority. That's why they act that way. It seems to me. That's why they have those resources in such a rundown neighborhood. Um, they obviously have the power, the influence, the status to drive around like the rules don't apply to them. But they're going to live by the sword and die by the sword. Those are the kinds of people that get shot in that neighborhood. Those are the people that get targeted in those neighborhoods. And the crossfire frequently kills the innocent along with those living that lifestyle, and it's bad for the whole city. But what happens in these areas is the police stand down, the police retreat from these areas. And New Orleans has a problem that many American cities do now, that it's impossible to recruit the police. I was reading in the New Orleans Advocate, which is the major newspaper, that the police department was celebrating that they had slowed down the rate of resignations, and they counted that a major success.
I think that one of the things that we as, shall we say, like, we're kind of downstream of red America, right? Of traditional conservatives, you and I. Both of us come from, very conservative areas, kind of a American conservative tradition. And associated with that is a respect for the institution of the police, right?
Right.
But I think that there's something to be said for the fact that you can be a fan of law and order, a fan of things working correctly, and also look at our law enforcement apparatus with a certain amount of disdain, right? That these people stood down, while most cities, faced some sort of rioting in the past several years. They were seemingly quite happy to enforce COVID lockdowns, and then now essentially you're doing nothing. And I think there's something to be said for the fact, and obviously I don't mean to be too unfair. My town actually did a pretty good job of making sure that there was no George Floyd damage. So there's that, right? I'm not going to say not all, of course, but I think there's something to be said for the fact that, when we've you know spent however many generations, deconstructing values, essentially creating these men without chests, to kind of paraphrase Lewis, that, well, of course we don't have selfless defenders of public virtue, right? Of course not. We made it impossible to be that type of person anymore. And if you are that type of person, you're probably too smart to do it, because right, that you're just one mistake away from having your life ruined. And look, I'm not one to say that the police should be rolling around blasting anyone that looks at them funny. That's not my point. My point is, like, why are we surprised that the quality of the police is low? Like, if you have any other option, right, you'll be doing something else, for any
Yeah,
numbers of reasons. Anyway,
for sure. I don't understand how police officers can do that line of work anymore. It seems so compromising. It seems so dangerous. Um, and it's not the violence that seems so dangerous to me as is the likelihood you enforce the law and someone's there with a camera and they crucify you for it. That's what I have always been more concerned about in that line of work anyway. I would never consider doing it.
there's something to be said for the fact that this state of decay is useful, right? And it's not useful to me. It's not useful to you. But if you are, the party of power, then this situation is incredibly helpful to you, because it is basically an incredibly cheap way to pay off your clients, right? And in fact, it's incredibly cheap because you don't actually have to do anything. You just have to stop doing something. And when you consider that, right, that this is essentially just an easy way to pay off party clients, right? And it's conveniently also a way to punish people you don't like, then really it makes a lot of sense within that framework. I don't think that you can solve every issue, unlock every problem by just looking at it through the lens of patronage, right? But I think it fits this model pretty well. That if you look at least especially local level law enforcement, that has traditionally not been a client of Blue America, right? And I realize, okay, in some places like Chicago, they technically vote blue, but like, let's be honest. The difference between Chicago when the police unions run things and when Lori Lightfoot run things is pretty dramatic, even though both of those people are Democrats. But I don't know, to me, it just is in all of this very clear that the people in power don't care. This isn't a problem to them. It's a solution, if anything.
It's a bizarre trouble in New Orleans. New Orleans just attempted to recall the mayor, and the mayor is responsible for all the draconian COVID protocols that they attempted and failed with.
Is this
The
Latoya the Destroyer?
Yes, yes, locals will call her Latoya the Destroya. Um, well, she faced a recall attempt and it failed. And I was driving around in Uptown and I carried several fares that were really enthusiastic about the recall effort. And I liked to prompt them to tell me more. I would always say, "Well, I don't know anything about it. Tell me more." And their argument was she's incompetent and the police department is falling apart and the roads are full of potholes, things like that. And they would mention scandals that she was involved in. Yes, she's been involved in many scandals. Um, but in New Orleans, you usually have to wait until the mayor leaves office before you can put them in the penitentiary. Um, and she's probably going to end up there someday. It wouldn't surprise me in the least. But the recall effort against her failed. And the question that I always had for the supporters of the recall was, who will replace her? And what do you want the city government to do? And the people that I talked to that supported the recall efforts, they had no candidate. You know, it was going to be someone in the city government that was gonna replace Latoya Cantrell, but, um, they didn't have anyone outstanding to replace her. There was no one waiting in the wings, no obvious choice, no obvious successor, and they it's too unpopular to say, "Let's just enforce the law." Let's make an example of the criminals that terrorize us or something like that. Um, there are way too many people breaking the law with impunity, and it's been going on for so long that a change in regime is going to be a very stark difference. And the comfortable bohemians that live in Uptown are the last people in the world to suggest such a change. They wouldn't countenance such a change. They would oppose such a change. They'd go and march against it or something. So
What?
until then, they really it's the bad policy is its own punishment.
Well,
They
and
they
that's
get their
been
car windows smashed. They get mugged on the street. There are drive-by shootings at popular restaurants. All of this has happened and happens very frequently. Um, it must continue to happen, and until there is someone in authority that's willing to put their foot down. And it's not going to be. I don't think it's going to be a popular uprising because any regular person outside of administration that gets up and says, "Let's set up let's set up stocks in public places for carjackers, for muggers. You know, let's just target certain crimes that we really do want to curb, and let's do what is necessary to make examples of these nefarious actors." Um, any regular person that makes suggestions about how to deal with the lawlessness, the anarchy that governs certain neighborhoods in New Orleans would get crucified for suggesting such a thing. But if someone was in the city government and said, "Well, I'm going to lead on this. You know, these laws are on the books. We are going to enforce them. Let's go round up the prostitutes. We know where they are. Okay, let's make an example here and say we really are serious about enforcing this law. You cannot sell yourself on the street." Um, that
to be
person could
fully
actually lead the
fair,
way. You know,
uh, to be fully fair, I do believe that that mass prostitution is somewhat of a New Orleans tradition, right? It weren't a large number of early settlers to New Orleans, French prostitutes rounded up in raids.
yes, that's one of the stories.
One of the
But it used to be a more a concealed thing to be sure.
right, right. I understand your point. And there's something, I don't know. There's something odd about this because if you ever talked with progressives, you'll notice that there's a way that progressives will status signal amongst themselves about things like this. You know, I always think of there's a classic, you know, it's a very old, you know, Seth Rogen tweet where he's chronicling all 6 times that his car has been broken into in San Francisco and how proud he is of that. You know, because he didn't care about his car, and someone obviously needed it. You'll notice that this is actually something that Curtis Yarvin brings up as well in Open Letter. You know, he recounts a kind of a similar anecdote, you know, from going to Bay Area parties in the 90s. We're almost being victimized by this to a certain point and not caring, you know, is kind of a status play, which is interesting, right? Because that speaks not only to a certain amount of like decadence, right? You can take the hit, which I guess is the flex in all of it. But you do wonder at which point, like, at what point it actually starts to hurt. when the crime actually starts to get scary. And I guess it's more than this. Paul W. Hall in chat. New Orleans used to be a city of bordellos, not a city of streetwalkers, which I think is an important distinction.
Oh, Paul W. Hall, you have a wonderful profile figure. Do you know who
Definitely.
that is, Jay Burden?
No, I do not.
That looked like Leonidas Polk, the Bishop of Louisiana.
Huh.
Is that who that is, Paul W. Hall?
We'll see in chat. They're a little bit behind us, so if he does confirm it, I'll bring it back up.
Well, I've been
And
to visit his grave. He's buried on St. Charles Avenue in the Episcopalian Cathedral of New Orleans. He's buried right beside the altar, and I have gone there several times. When I drive past it, I salute him.
that's and I think it's one of the things that's, and this is not perhaps the biggest, moral crime in all of this, but it's the biggest aesthetic crime, right? It is seeing these, centers of culture, because there are beautiful things in many American cities, and seeing them kind of covered in, covered in graffiti and human filth and vagrants. This is something I actually noticed first in DC. Paul W. Hall said it's Major General Sterling Price, but he did serve under Polk, rather. Anyway, sorry, just a note about Paul W. Hall's profile picture. But I noticed this when I went to DC, before COVID. They were kind of ahead of us on that. That the kind of beautiful public areas, right, which DC has any number of, have essentially become unusable for normal citizens, right?
Right.
Because you have, these kind of like swarms of, rough sleepers, right? And to me, right, I'm a young guy. I'm, of a certain size, and generally I'm not particularly physically intimidated, by people like that. It's just like, but especially for, people of smaller stature, the elderly, women, right? Like, that's a genuine physical danger.
Absolutely.
And again, it's like all of this, these places that our ancestors have invested for our benefit, right? They devoted their resources, their time. They gave up the opportunity for more homes and more businesses to set aside green space. But if you actually go into them, right, they're full of needles and human waste, and, you might get shivved. Very famously, right, I believe that the founder of Cash App, right, in San Francisco, an incredibly wealthy man, was stabbed to death.
Right.
And recently a Rand Paul staffer was stabbed in the head by a crazy man with a screwdriver for no personal vendetta, just because, he was angry. And again, it just goes back to the line that keeps going through my head is we don't have to live like this. It doesn't have to be like this. Even within living memory, it wasn't like this.
Yes, indeed. And you can look up old videos of New Orleans on YouTube, videos from the 70s, say, and just look at the people walking around, look at how they're dressed, look at how they're behaving themselves, and you know that times have changed very dramatically and for the worse. You can see the buildings, you can see the street scene, you can see images of the major parks, and you can see that times have changed qualitatively. We can watch those videos with any number of places and cities, and notice the change in what the norms were. And these social norms are things that are very important to us. You were absolutely right that people are deterred from public areas by the presence of insanity, right? People walking around, aggressive, crazy people that want to talk to you about nonsense or to demand money or something like that. I carry tourists through a certain area where the big homeless encampments are. Strangely enough, that is adjacent to major tourist areas. And one of the most popular attractions in New Orleans, the World War II Museum, backs up to a homeless encampment. The homeless are camped right beside it. And I carry people past it, and the responses are very interesting. When they're wealthy locals on their way home in Uptown, they don't they don't seem to notice it at all. It's just part of what they expect of the city. So there's a kind of calculated blindness that goes with it. Of course, if you see something every day, it's really not gonna phase you. So go figure. Um, I'm not trying to come down especially hard on them, though it actually is their responsibility. They should be demanding something should be done about it. It's their city, right? It's not my city. I don't actually live there. I just work there. Um, but the tourists, I take the tourists by, and I hear really interesting comments from them. Uh, some some gentleman the other night said, "How is this possible in this country that people should be living this way?" I pass an area where there is a local crazy that I see very regularly. Not I don't pass his intersection every day, but I pass it frequently enough, and he harangues me outside of my car. He comes right up to my window and starts yelling at me. And he's demanding money from me, is what he's doing. I know what he's up to. But he's out there every day, so far as I can tell. And he must live there. I mean, there are a number of people who live there, but he's out there aggressively, trying to get something from it. Um, he will harangue people while I've got folks in the car, and he frightens my fares frequently. He's not impersonating Michael Jackson, but I'm sure that he would be much more comely if he did. Um, this all goes back to one of your original points that we aren't doing anyone any good by allowing them to go crazy in public for the remainder of their lives. That's inhumane. And it's inhumane to not enforce laws on hard drugs, for instance, or laws on vagrancy, like camping out in a public park, building a hut complex with a grill and everything out there. So much so that the city uh, tries to accommodate you by installing a porta potty nearby. That isn't doing anyone any good, and it enables more lawlessness. There was a time, and if you look back at the old video pictures of New Orleans, um, in that period of American history, people that went insane in public were forcibly restrained. They were treated as if they had lost their adult agency, and if necessary, they were made wards of the state. And it's not as if a mental asylum is at all an attractive place to be, but it is an honest attempt of public authority to deal with mental illness or whatever it is that afflicts them. In a mental institution, if they get a hold of heroin, it would be against the rules and in spite of a great many prohibitions and regulations, right? It's a controlled environment. Out on the street, it happens in plain sight. And you often wonder, I mean, normally regular folks avoid these areas. They don't want to go near those people. They aren't going to ask them questions. What are you going to do? Go and ask those people questions. You would be seen as confronting them, right? That's an aggressive thing. And you could get crucified for that. We know what the media does with people like that. Oh, you're judging them. You're making them feel inferior or something. No, you why bother? Go somewhere else. You avoid them. You avoid them like the plague. And they sit there and they overdose. And I may have seen that sort of thing. I mean, to see those people passed out on the side of the road is normal. In those areas, you see people lying around on the sidewalk, and they could be dead. They may very well be dead. I don't know. I'm not going to stop. But that's also dehumanizing to the people that see them, right? We ought to care more about our fellow citizens than to allow them to destroy themselves in broad daylight. So you can put me on the record. Public asylums, state-funded mental institutions, uh, forcible incarceration in these institutions, like the state going out and taking people off the street and testing them to see if they're able to support themselves, aggressively enforcing vagrancy laws. That's all completely reasonable. There's a reason why all those things are on the books. And our cities would be much better off with that. In the state of Virginia, just as an example, I remember where the state mental institution was up in Stanton, up in the mountains. The state of Virginia used to have those institutions, and then they privatized the whole thing. They emptied out the asylums. They sent those people out onto the streets, and they proliferated there since then. It hasn't helped that in America we don't have a compelling vision of the good life, the healthy life, the normal life. Instead, our public authorities have openly encouraged what John Stuart Mill called experiments in living. John Stuart Mill, the great old liberal, the Englishman, he said, "Oh, well, no one really knows what a healthy life looks like. Nobody really knows what anybody's supposed to believe about anything. So, what we want to do is we want to encourage everyone to experiment, and we want to get rid of those or to marginalize those that insist on standards and norms. It's actually the people that believe in norms who are the problem." John Stuart Mill argued philosophically. We're now really we're living in the results of that experiment gone haywire. And I think this was the inevitable result, by the way. There was a time when bohemians could say, "Oh, well, I'm gonna have an experimental life. You know, I'm gonna live with 5 cats and never get married or something." And everyone could look at that askance and say, "Okay, well, you aren't hurting anybody," right? Now an experimental life is living in a tent in a public park and getting high on heroin whenever you can get the money for it, or fentanyl or whatever the drug of the day is. And the tolerant liberals that run policy in our major cities, they look at that, they see it, and they ask, "Well, who am I to say otherwise? Who am I to say no to that? Maybe I'm insane and they're living the good life. Who can say otherwise?" I had a fare in my car. They were from California. They had California opinions. I was not surprised by what they had to say about it. They brought up the the drug addiction, the homelessness in public areas, and they said, "Well, we know they have no agency. It's actually all, outside of their free will. They have to use drugs because they are sick. It's all an addiction and no one can do anything about it." And I was really I was really amazed. Um, the lady, uh, the with this couple that was in my car, the couple from California. The lady said that she was a registered nurse, and she said that she had seen people overdose on the sidewalk in San Francisco. And she confessed that she felt like she ought to do something about it, but she knew that she couldn't. She could not intervene because it was simply too dangerous. And what was the danger exactly? The publicity. What would the media say if you intervened and told them, "No, you should not kill yourself by taking these drugs. Let me take you away from here and get you treatment. Let's take you to the hospital so that you don't die here in the gutter." That is too controversial. That is too controversial in our world. And it's
Well,
a sign that our civilization really is falling apart pretty quickly right now.
it is, and it really is. You can't say these people are inconsistent. It's a double negative, but they are consistent because it's the ultimate conclusion of the idea that, well, what is evil? Well, evil is to restrict someone's personal choice. And if someone's personal choice is to live in a pile of trash and do drugs and slowly kill themselves in public and scream at other people, ruining their lives and that of others, well, if it's their free choice, who are we to stop it? And it's diseased thinking. It's genuinely diseased thinking. You can't let yourself fall into that trap of believing, well, oh, it's their decision, because obviously, right, if you step outside of it, you realize that this is far from compassionate. That these people are enabling these unfortunates, right, people who ought to be cared for, to essentially, live like a subhuman existence. And George, we're coming up on time. We've been going for a little over an hour. I'm gonna read the 2 super chats, and if you want, you can close us out.
Indeed.
So, Douglas Dimmadome, owner of the Dimsdale Dimmadome, for $2. We love the Pretulac. I don't know what that means, but I was paid to say it, so I wholly endorse it. And Luthemplar for $2. For-profit prisons are sinful. I largely agree. There should be, if anything, no incentive whatsoever to increase the number of prisoners. Anyway, Bagby, do you have anything to say as we close this out?
Well, we haven't talked about policy, and policy is fun, and policy is also very dangerous. Let me say something controversial before my final statement. I honestly think that something very, very simple like public stocks would be great for any number of different crimes. And I think it would be far more humane than a penitentiary. Say like a day in the public stocks for a year in the penitentiary for more petty crimes. That could be a decent trade-off. And I certainly think the death penalty is much more humane than life in prison. But yeah, I know not everyone's going to agree with me on that. Just think of me as a hopeless medievalist or something, and dismiss me accordingly, if that upsets you. But all that to go back to the bigger point, the big takeaway, we have to have a vision of a good life. We have to have a vision of normalcy. And when we look at the dysfunction of the great American cities these days and their decline in several respects, just with anarchic elements, if nothing else, we ought to remember we have to propose a serious way of living, a normal way of living, which involves shared values, a shared sense of what is good, what is virtuous, along with what is evil. Now, there there are those in our spheres that have talked about, well, the evil, that's all something we can agree on. Well, yes, I understand that, and it has a way of uniting people. Oh, we're all against these things, so we can get together politically. I get it, and I'm not opposed to that level of organization. But what I am saying is that to make headway, to have positive policy victories, we have to come together on what we think is normal, what we think is desirable. We need to have a vision of the good. Because as Chesterton once said, a young man can keep himself from disease by constantly, or he can constantly think about STDs or something and stay free of disease. But a young man can also remain free of disease by constantly thinking of the Virgin Mary. And there's no question which of those is more wholesome. So with that, it's a pleasure to be with you tonight. Thanks a lot for inviting me back.
Definitely, I always enjoy our conversations. Bagby's Telegram, I believe, is linked in the description, as well as my links. You know, if you want to support the show, I do not expect it, but I certainly appreciate it. Hope you guys have gotten used to the new, more sparse schedule. It's been easier on me, and I feel like the episodes have been, a little bit better. Finally, in the final location, the audio is a little bit, touch and go, just as I kind of figured out the new setup. But it'll be steady from now on. No more moving around. So I'm thankful to you guys for kind of bearing with us, and to you guys at home, remember, keep your head up. The lie can't last forever. Good night.